Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Gary Numan, Intruder. Okay, I feel like this one's been a long time coming. People who've been following my channel for long enough know that I do like occasionally making videos in which I catch up on the entire back catalogs of 80s synth-pop legends and cover them in overlong, mistitled, in-brief segments as preludes to reviews for their comeback albums, which are typically less important than my actual marathoning. In 2017, I reviewed Depeche Mode, Erasure, and OMD. Last year I covered Pet Shop Boys and Yellow. All of these videos performed pretty dang well, and it has been good for me as someone who does not have much personal connection to 80s synth pop in general to be able to get all this deeper education on longtime legends like this. But if you've seen those other videos where I marathon synth pop back catalogs, I have mentioned a few times that I do have a personal connection with one particular new wave hit. One that isn't actually from the 80s, but still became synonymous with that decade regardless. And that, of course, is Gary Numan's Cars. This track appeared on some compilation of, new wave one-hit wonders that my dad has, and I discovered it one day when I was still a little kid in grade school. Even well before finding out who Orbital were. I couldn't have been any older than 7 or 8, if not even younger. But I remember being completely mind-blown by that song. It sounded so freaking cool and unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Just oh my god, it's like synthesizer music. I want to play the synthesizer when I grow up. I also sort of overplayed the song since I was an 8-year-old with underdeveloped autistic brain and I hyperfixated on every new song that sounded marginally cool to me. But even if I did move on from Cars, I certainly was never gonna forget it. Now I had other brief inklings of what Gary Numan did in the following decades of my life. Sometime in middle school I got to hear a second track of his called Down in the Park that I thought was pretty dang cool. And in 2016, I got to hear a third song called Here For You when he collabed with Jean-Michel Jarre on that guy's Electronica 2 project. And I also thought that was pretty cool. Though I never properly looked into Gary Numan's full catalog, possibly because it was so freaking big. And I might have briefly looked over what people said on some of his stuff a few times out of curiosity in years previous and found out that his recent stuff is a lot more like Nine Inch Nails style industrial rock or something. And might have been a bit intimidated by that, too, since that style tends not to be my bag. But hey, we got this new album, and regardless of how edgy or industrial it's going to be, I figured it's about time I finally do my due diligence on this man's vast body of work, give all his stuff a fair shot. So I listened to all his previous 20 main studio albums, that includes the 2 he did as the frontman of the band Two Boy Army. This is going to be one of the longest and brief segments I've ever done, buckle in. By the way, if you're one of those people who thinks that, only those who were around at the time when this stuff released are allowed to have a valid perspective and opinion on this, then please just click off now if you haven't already. This is the opinion of a 25-year-old who only grew up with the one hit. My perspective is obviously not going to be the same as yours, and you'll just have to deal with it. Anyway, here's my thoughts on his discography so far. So I guess this is the point at which we have to start. The debut album from Two Boy Army from 1978, which isn't really even that electronic. It's primarily a collection of punk and post-punk material with just enough synths implemented throughout to qualify as new wave, and one of the very first examples of that genre. I can respect it for its place in history, but it definitely feels like the beginning of something that hasn't fully formed yet. A perfectly serviceable listen that can be striking in how excessively dorky it all is, both through Numan's own presence and the actual grooves, but it didn't really elicit any strong reaction out of me one way or the other, it was just kinda there. And now Two Boy Army is upgraded to making a concept album about Blade Runner replicant equivalents called Mockmen, doubling down on the more electronic aspects of the sound from the last album and polishing it all up to much more successful results. Also having Numan's dorky presence having much more of a paranoid, robotic quality to it that he's better known for, and being underpinned by so much creepier vibes and more minimalistic presentation makes it all a lot more effective and oddly easier to emotionally connect with. Down in the Park is still easily the best track in the bunch, hit me a lot harder when I figured out what it was doing in the greater context of the project. And the more up-tempo guitar-centric tracks in other parts, like You Are In My Vision, didn't wow me as much. But this whole thing is still really solid and surprisingly really well put together. Even ends in 2 pretty neat instrumental cuts. This was great, I'll hang on to this. Alright, first solo Gary Numan album. This was the one I was most looking forward to hearing, thanks to it being the album with Cars on it. And yeah, this was really solid too, though I have some slight reservations with it, most notably that the vast majority of the album sounds almost exactly like Cars, to the point of that track almost feeling like a filler cut in context. But aside from the track Conversation running on too long, I never got sick of the album's sound, and on top of all the isolated and brooding futuristic Kraftwerky goodness I expected, I also got the violin-tinged spookiness of Complex, I got the stomping epicness of Engineers, I got the pretty neat instrumental Air Lane, I got M.E., to which I instantly recognized as having been used as the core sample behind Basement Jaxx's Where's Your Head At? Did not see that coming. I was hoping this project would have a bit more dimensionality than it does, but I'll still definitely take it. This was still great. This album is the final volume in what Numan calls his Machine Trilogy, Replicas and Pleasure Principle being the first 2. And I think this one might actually be the best of the 3. Most of it explores the same mixes of sounds as his last album, but the tunes have more distinct identity apart from each other. There's a few more creative and interesting ideas and even better hooks. It might not have scored him another big hit like the last 2 did, and there's not really any one track on here that feels like an obvious standout in that way, but there's not a single weak moment on it either. Like, this was the project I hoped the Pleasure Principle was gonna be. I loved it. Alright, this was another one I was excited to hear since reportedly it was a move in a much less commercially focused direction, supposedly a jazzier take on his sound, and even citing the likes of Brian Eno's Another Green World as an influence. Sounded right up my alley, despite apparently being a pretty controversial move for him. And yeah, I thought this was great as well. Now, this probably isn't as much of a radical shift for him as some people have made it out to be. It's not like he's completely ditched his old style or become unrecognizable. It's still fundamentally an electronic project like his others, but this is way more laid back and meandery. There's tracks with big saxophone solos and some funkier influences. And the best moment has to be Cry the Clock Said. A 10-minute cut that is nothing but minimal clicking percussion, a few ambient synth licks, and some occasional vocal interjections from Numan. And all came together well enough that I legit got taken off guard when it finished, and I was like, what, it's over already? Yeah, these are the kind of projects I most enjoy running into when marathoning big catalogs like this. I'm definitely hanging on to this. Alright, doubling down on the funkier direction with this thing, which would become the norm for him for the remainder of the 80s. This one's a lot tighter and better focused than Dance, and the grooves are just as solid, though it's not nearly as interesting or varied. It did have a really strong finish with the last 2 cuts. The 1930s Rust was a great little goofy synth jazz cut, and We Take Mystery to Bed was a really satisfying and punchy synth funk banger in his usual style, and those left a good enough taste in my mouth to still come out positive on the whole thing, though A Dream of Siam is a dud, and the rest of it, while enjoyable enough, just blended in the background for me. Good, but not a keeper. This album marks the beginning of an era for Numan's career where pretty much everything he was putting out was getting consistently panned. This album takes the stuff he was doing on I, Assassin and cranks up the cheese factor to the same level that the album cover implies. Tons of super dated 80s guitar solos and sax solos all over the place that get tiring and occasionally even out of place. And a noticeable step down production-wise from the last project too. Apparently his label talked him into getting a co-producer, he tried to work with guitarist Bill Nelson, and they didn't get along and couldn't agree on how to mix and master it. And yeah, it kinda shows. It did still have a few solid moments I liked, such as The Iceman Comes and Sister Surprise, but the rest of the album is not terrible, but I did get sick of the style and need a short break by the end. You can skip this one. Alright, even worse album cover, stylistically in line with Warriors again, and I have no idea why or how, but I thought this was significantly better than both that album and Even I, Assassin. The grooves are way punchier and hit a lot harder. The sax solos and 80s guitars magically don't feel like a bad match anymore. He even added some cheesy female backup singers that worked way better than they had any right to, and he occasionally chopped up their voices to give this album a little bit of Jean-Michel Jarre energy. And it's surprisingly consistent too. I think the worst part might have been the violas on the intro of Cold Warning being processed so heavily to the point of sounding like synths, but that track was still good. I don't know how much I'm going to come back to it, and I don't even know how highly I can recommend it. I totally get all the critics who aren't into it, especially since it sticks to the same formula as his last two projects, but miraculously that formula just so happened to click for me this time. I will definitely take it. Like the last album, but more long-winded and a lot less impactful. All these tracks just seem to run on without going anywhere interesting, the backing vocalists starting to oversell their performances and got a tad obnoxious. And I'm not sure what this album offers groove-wise that Berserker didn't already do better. I like the track Tricks, had a bit of chaotic Art of Noise energy to it, I guess. And I Still Remember is a cool atmospheric closer too, but the rest is pretty boring. This one's pretty good though. He managed to make this album form a stronger sense of atmosphere and spaciousness that somehow brought it all together. And the opener, My Breathing, is legit one of the best tracks I've ever heard from him. It's not nearly as consistent as Berserker, still has some duds like New Thing from London Town or I Can't Stop, and the version I listened to had one of the most baffling mastering jobs I've ever heard, with a lot of moments where the volume just randomly lowers, and still managing to clip the audio right after lowering it sometimes. Several tracks on here were totally butchered, but in spite of that, I'd still call it one of his better projects from this era. It's not bad. Well, this sure is an album that exists. Supposedly it's louder, more aggressive, and angrier than his other mid-later 80s releases, but not by much. More than anything, it just blends into all the other stuff from this period, like a more forgettable Berserker. Not an offensive listen, but definitely nothing essential either. It elicited no reaction from me at all. Well, this has his best album cover in a very long time, and the sci-fi movie samples are a neat touch, but it is just the same old cheesy electro-funk stuff as all his other albums from this period, and it's getting really goddamn played out. Also, this came out in 1991, and he still sounds stuck in the mid-80s. Can't possibly imagine why this wasn't successful. Okay, I was kinda intrigued by this one, since I have never seen a single person defend it. Fans hate it, critics hate it, even Numan himself publicly hates it too, and has seemingly done his best to bury it. It nearly led to him completely bottoming out financially, and it's now pretty hard to find. I still managed to find it and went into it half hoping to like it purely so I could go against the grain. And I didn't. But I'll tell you what, unlike his last several, it is definitely not boring. Like, if you thought albums like Outland and Warriors were too cheesy, it is nothing compared to this project, which is trying so hard to be commercial and trendy that Numan is barely even present on it at all. He's buried in the mix of low-rent Jam and Lewis wannabe production, with his backup singers getting even more focus, and the whole thing already sounds really flat and muddy. There's one attempt at New Jack Swing with Numan trying to rap on it, and even a fucking Prince cover. Those go over about as well as you'd expect. There's a ballad called I Wonder, which sounds almost exactly like Depeche Mode's Never Let Me Down Again, and another called Love Isolation, which feels predictive of the Titanic soundtrack. And that's not even getting into the two tracks with fake endings. Those had me legit cracking up. I can't openly defend or recommend any of this, and I'm never gonna listen to it again, but it is just such a gigantic what the fuck moment for him that it could legit come back around into becoming entertaining again. Check it out at your own risk. Okay, so obviously after the complete train record that was Machine and Soul, Numan decided it was finally time to stop trying for radio play altogether, resulting in a major switch up into dark wave, industrial, and goth rock styles. No more sax solos, no more funk guitars, just going back to basics. Now, all the Nine Inch Nails comparisons I saw had me expecting something a lot more abrasive than what I got. The result comes a lot closer to the likes of Depeche Mode's Songs of Faith and Devotion, also with more breakbeats and spoken word passages. It may revel in its dark and edgy aesthetics and have a lot of anti-religious themes in the lyrics, but it's still a synth-pop project at its core that doesn't sacrifice the core style that first put Numan on the map. I'm sorry. Admittedly, I can't say I love this thing. The production's still a bit on the thin and underwhelming side, but it is easily the most respectable thing he'd done in over a decade. Like the last album, but with better production and more distorted guitars, also much less interesting a listen that mostly ran together for me and fell in the background. Lyrically, it's pretty cool, with him really doubling down and going further into the anti-religious themes, which would paint pretty much all his stuff afterwards. But musically, it's enjoyable enough, but mostly felt like wallpaper music to me. Okay, here's where the Nine Inch Nails sound really comes in full swing. The guitars are way more intense and distorted, the beats way heavier, the synth ambience a lot more expansive and almost cinematic, though Numan's voice definitely brings a different energy to these instrumentals than Trent Reznor would. And despite being even more abrasive than his last two albums, and also kinda running together, it was an unexpectedly noticeable step up in terms of personal enjoyment, too. I've historically made it clear that I'm not typically much of an industrial or metal guy. I still have yet to listen to any Nine Inch Nails album beyond the Downward Spiral. But I guess I have softened on these kinds of more abrasive sounds over the years, and I mostly just appreciated this thing for how epic and impressive the production was. Don't think I'm keeping it, but this is quite solid. Like the last album, but a few minutes longer and with even less variety. The title track stood out for having more whispering vocals and big synth strings, but that's about it. It was cool, I guess. I have a feeling this last leg of his career is just gonna stick to this formula from here on out. This album was markedly better than Jagged, though. Roughly equal in the hooks department, but better varied thanks to some instrumental cuts and some more piano-driven and abstract-leaning tracks that help break up the sound and contrast with the more metal and industrial-heavy stuff. Still not sure if I'm so into it where I see myself coming back to it, but that bit of variety does go a long way. Probably ended up being my favorite post-sacrifice project of his in this marathon as a result. Well, this might just be his single most impressively produced project to date. Makes me wish I connected more with this particular style than I do, but if you are more of an industrial rock person looking for a good starting point into this era of his catalog, this would probably be it. Or this one if you like. Musically rehashes all the same ideas and style from the last album, but combines it with a narrative concept about the world having turned into a desert because climate change, and the idea of Eastern and Western cultures coming together. Also, all the same anti-religious themes popping up as usual. Bit more musically interesting than the last album, thanks to the Middle Eastern influences creeping in, as well as a bit of occasional orchestral movie soundtrack bombast. Pretty cool stuff. Might even be more accessible than the last project, though it still runs on a bit too long for its own good and got kind of repetitive and stale by the second half. Still, this is solid. Which, at long last, brings us to here. Guy's still going strong at age 63. I'll admit he only has 4 albums that I'm definitely hanging on to, with Replicas, Pleasure Principle, Telecon, and Dance. And I don't see myself doing a proper full-on series on him. This in brief segment was probably enough. But he's definitely earned my full respect for his place in history. Guy's definitely stuck to his guns doing his own thing this entire time. Even during the critically panned 80s funk sellout years, I still got the feeling that he was doing this stuff primarily because that was what he actually enjoyed hearing in more radio-friendly music of the time, even if those albums also helped me understand why some people can't stand sax solos in general. And this whole marathon has had enough scattered high points throughout, even in its worst moments, for me to come out of the whole thing not as exhausted as I expected. I didn't come out of this totally sick of his style like I did when I went through all the Pet Shop Boys albums. Now, going into this latest album, I had a pretty strong feeling I knew exactly what I was gonna get. I had a feeling we were basically gonna get another album like Splinter, with lots of industrial Nine Inch Nails grooves, distorted metal guitars, combined with the dark synth-pop styles that originally made him famous. Had a feeling it would be the kind of thing I would generally like enough to recommend to his core fan base or those into this specific genre, but maybe not have much specific to discuss, and almost certainly not be into enough to want to keep around past this video. But after actually listening to Intruder, well, that was mostly what I got. Though not all of my predictions were 100% accurate. First and foremost, this is not another album like Splinter, it's another album like Savage. The mix of sounds he explores here is very much the same as his previous project from 2017. The metal guitars and distorted grooves are always there, but the concern is put more on creating an expansive sense of atmosphere, accentuated through the kinds of dramatic synth textures he's best known for, as well as some more orchestral bombast, as well as a light influence from Middle Eastern culture playing into the melodies occasionally. The sound of everything really isn't that abrasive. It's intense, but it's intense in such a way that you don't necessarily have to be a fan of industrial music in order to find it appealing. Like, it could work on a similar level to a hybrid album or something. I was correct in that this album doesn't really give me a lot to break down or discuss, though. Pretty much all of these tracks go for the same sonic formulas all the way through, and whether any track is gonna stick is entirely dependent on the lead melodies and hooks. And even those can sound pretty similar from track to track. The good news, though, is that all the melodies and hooks are really solid, and the album was consistent enough in that department that it still managed to be an all-around really enjoyable listen. Even if it's probably not the kind of thing I see myself keeping around long term, I can definitely qualify it as a solid effort. Now, in order to make sure I wasn't missing anything important, I did look over the lyrics and take a guess what theme they primarily tackle. What's that? They discuss anti-religious themes? Nah, they're really songs about, like, partying down in the club with all his homies. Yeah, of course they discuss anti-religious themes. They're songs about how he feels betrayed by God, how God isn't listening to your prayers, righteous bitterness at the people who use God as an excuse to commit atrocities, that kind of thing. Though there's also tracks that uses typical subject matter as a way to talk about climate change and humans bringing the world to an end. And there were a few tracks that I think were about having free will and the power to do what we want regardless of God's supposed influence. And even a few tracks that just seem to be about regular heartbreak? Or I don't know. There's no overarching story or anything, it's just kind of a collection of tracks with similar themes. The lyrics certainly don't feel unimportant, but I also don't feel like you especially need to read along with them to get into these tracks. And as for how it fares musically, like I said, it's the kind of album where going down track by track really in depth would mostly just lead to me saying the same stuff over and over. I guess the album is a bit on the long side, could have been stronger with more cutting down. Tracks like And It Breaks Me Again or When You Fall are mostly just kinda there and blend into everything else. Maybe those could have been cut. And there's two different versions of the track The End of Dragons, which I'm not really sure you needed both of these. The alternate beatless version that closes the project out is markedly better and more emotionally resonant than the original, which just kinda sounds like everything else on here. Though that would have been one of the better tracks on here in either case. For what it's worth, this album's hour-long length still feels better justified than Savage, which had me mostly tuning out after the halfway mark. This project spread out its best material throughout its running time. My favorite track on here was probably I Am Screaming, had a slightly more toned down and less distortion-heavy mix of sounds. The orchestra sounded gorgeous, and the hook was one of the catchiest on here. The track that stands out as most intense and energetic is probably The Chosen, cranks up the tempo and the guitar distortion a bit. But as far as more energetic cuts go, I was more of a fan of Saints and Liars, which had this kind of like twitchy guitar riff that stuck in my head pretty easily. And I thought A Black Sun was one of the most emotionally resonant moments on here, and especially I liked its intro of more minimal piano playing. And there's some female backing vocals on here that I think come from his own daughters that sound great too. I think they also show up on Now and Forever, and that was another favorite. And texturally, those are about all the moments that really stick out to me, though other tracks like Betrayed, The Gift, or Is This World Not Enough have been growers as well thanks to their particularly strong hooks. This album obviously benefited quite a bit from being the only album of his I listened to more than once in preparation for this video, though even on first listen I wouldn't have any trouble marking the hooks on this album as among his best and most easily memorable and replayable in a long time. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to break down on this album, so I guess that just leaves whether I recommend it. Yeah, it's worth a shot if you're curious. It's obviously guaranteed to please his core fan base. It'll give them exactly what they want, and relies on all the same strengths that as all his albums since Pure, and even happens to be among the best examples of said strengths. Maybe not his most brutal, if that's what you're looking for, but certainly a very impressive work that's all around very well produced, still managing to create a strong sense of space and atmosphere despite being totally bricked out. And for his non-fans, well, I'm not sure if this is the best possible place to start when you obviously got his classics like Pleasure Principle and Telecon sitting right there, but it certainly wouldn't be a bad place to start either. It feels like a more easily accessible look on the sounds he's been exploring in the past 2 decades or so. And as for myself, while I don't think this is going to end up becoming one of my favorites of the year or anything, or even the kind of thing I see myself hanging on to much beyond this video, still a bit too samey for my liking, I definitely had enough fun with this to co-sign it. It's an all-around solid listen, worth giving a shot, and I'll overall give it a 7.3 out of 10. But of course, it is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.